Hi, my name's Stephen Ryan, and I'd like to talk to you a little about an article that appeared in a recent edition of English Language Teaching Journal, ELTJ, and that's volume 64, issue 4. And the title of the article is A Mindset for EFL, a Learner's Beliefs about the Role of Natural Talent. Before I go on, I'd just like to thank Hugh Jarvis for giving us this opportunity to talk about our work, and I'd also like to mention my camera shy co-author Sarah Mercer, who's unable to be here with me, but this is very much a joint work. So the article is really, the starting point is really this idea of the natural language learner, a natural talent for languages. We've all heard this said, but our interest is really on how such beliefs impact on learning and approaches to learning. And our starting point for this is the psychological concept of mindsets. So what are mindsets? Well, mindsets are most closely associated with the American psychologist Carol Dweck. And over the years, Dweck and various associates have been looking at something she terms implicit theories of intelligence. And these implicit theories represent really fundamental assumptions we make, assumptions that are often so fundamental that we may struggle to articulate them. And she identifies two principal sets of theories: an entity theory and an incremental theory. An entity theory is this idea that intelligence, the capacity to learn, is something that's fixed within the individual. It's basically something you're born with, and there's not much you can do to change it. You're given something, and that's your lot. On the other hand, an incremental theorist sees intelligence as something much more malleable, something that can be developed through purposeful use and effort. So, two basic sets of theories, but this sort of terminology, implicit theories of intelligence, well, I know certainly when I first came across this, I found it a little off-putting, intimidating, and I think other language teachers I knew felt similarly. Unfortunately, Dweck helps us out here because in her later work, some of her more popular work, she refers to mindsets, and a fixed mindset is roughly equivalent to this entity theory, and a growth mindset equating to an incremental theory. And our interest in this paper was really to think about how we could apply these theories to the field of language learning. After all, within mainstream psychology, there's a substantial body of work that looks at how mindsets and these implicit theories affect behavior and learning in fields such as sport, music, fields where the role of natural talent, natural ability, plays a significant part. And we thought it a little odd that, given the prevalence of these ideas in the field of language learning, that there's no real work being done in this area. So this was our starting point. And our study that we talk about in this ELTJ article is really a small-scale exploratory study, with our interest being really to see if our hunches were correct, to see if this was something worth pursuing further. So, a small-scale exploratory study with first-year English learners in both Austria and Japan. University learners, that is. A series of in-depth, semi-structured interviews, Well, let's go on to just discuss some of the more sort of salient findings here. Okay. So, well, the first thing our data seems to be telling us was that we should be really thinking of mindset in terms of a continuum rather than a simple dichotomy. In one of her earlier papers, Dweck refers to a world from two perspectives, which to me seems to imply quite a strong dichotomy there. But our data was suggesting we had extreme positions, but most people were lying somewhere along a continuum between these extremes, with general tendencies to one side or the other. I think one of our students put it best when she put a numerical value on this thing. She just said, well, it's 60% hard work and 40% natural ability. And this was kind of indicative of what we were finding, that mindsets appear to be a continuum with people rather than a dichotomy. The second thing that stood out was the idea of domain-specific mindsets. In the mainstream psychology literature, there's a lot of work that shows that we don't really have one overriding single mindset. It's possible to have a fixed mindset in one domain and a growth mindset in another. So, for example, I may believe that something like musical ability is fixed. You're basically born musical or you're not. And if you're not born musical, there's nothing you can really do to make yourself musical. Whereas in the field of sports, I may feel that you work hard, you can become a good sportsman. It's all about effort and practice. So it's possible to have different mindsets in different domains. And what our data seemed to be telling us was that within the single domain of language learning, there seems to be other subdomains at a skill level. So it was possible to have a fixed mindset for one skill area and a more growth-oriented mindset in another. For example, the field of pronunciation seemed to have a tendency towards a fixed mindset, that you got people who are good at pronunciation who were good at it because they were naturally good at it. The consequences of mindsets that we found were, for example, in the goals learners were setting for themselves. People with fixed mindsets tended to have limited goals, to restrict the goals that they set themselves. They tended to believe that, well, effort can take you so far, but to get to a really good level, you needed to have some gift. You need to be born with the talent. And effort was only part of the story, and without this natural talent, you really couldn't achieve certain levels of proficiency. Another consequence of mindsets seems to be in how people regarded the process of language acquisition. There's a tendency for people with a fixed mindset to see language learning as very much a natural process, that something that occurred in naturalistic settings, especially linked to study abroad. And this again seemed to be perhaps a little disempowering for people who are studying in classrooms. The next thing we considered was really, where did these mindset beliefs come from? And one thing we found was, social comparison processes. People looking around them, looking at their classmates, what's going on, observing what's going on in their classroom, and from these observations, coming to certain conclusions. So we had one person, when asked, do you think there's such a thing as a natural ability for languages, She answers, yes, I do, because if I compare people in our class, there are really hard-working people and people who do nothing and get the same grades. So here we kind of see these social comparisons influencing ideas about how to approach language learning. And another influence we found on the construction of mindsets was a cultural base. We were looking at two very different educational contexts, Austria and Japan. And we found within the Austrian learners a general tendency towards a more fixed mindset, and the Japanese ostensibly had a more growth-orientated mindset with a strong belief, a strong faith almost in the efficacy of effort and persistence. But when we sort of scratched below the surface of these Japanese learners, we saw perhaps there was something else there. I asked one young woman, so which is more important, natural talent or hard work? And she laughed, hard work. And she asked herself why. Some people, in some cases, people who study hard, but they don't speak well. So then I asked them, so what's stopping them speaking well? And she said, their brain. And this idea of their brain seems to be very suggestive of a fixed mindset. So while she may be expressing ideas consistent with a growth mindset, there's something there that suggests something more fixed. Okay, so as a teacher, what does all this mean? What are the implications of all this? Well, if we go back to the general psychology literature, there's a very strong consensus that a growth mindset is more conducive to successful learning. So as teachers, we want to be doing things to encourage, to foster growth mindsets in our learners. And the data shows that the classroom environment plays a role in the formation of these mindsets. And one thing it seems to me that as teachers, we need to be aware of this and also aware of the implicit messages we're sending to learners. One thing that immediately comes to mind is this idea of how we praise, how we encourage learners. Perhaps we need to focus praise much more on effort and the work learners are doing rather than the consequences, the successes. So effort praise seems to be something that may help encourage a growth mindset. And also, these implicit theories, by definition, are things we're sometimes not aware of. And perhaps a little more explicit discussion of these ideas may help both learners and teachers. So, we have to be careful because, as I said, this study was really small scale and exploratory in nature. So the conclusions we draw here are tentative, to say the least. But I think they are promising. And when we started this project, I think perhaps our conceptualization of mindsets was a little too simplistic. And the data seems to be telling us that it's far more complex and sophisticated than we first envisaged. And I actually think that's a good thing because it means there's a lot more for us to find out, a lot more for us to research, study, and perhaps benefit from. And that's what we intend to do. And I hope perhaps somebody out there listening, watching, might be tempted to do so too. So thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, thank you. Goodbye.